last long. You're listening to KUOW News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, working to develop new cancer therapies by attacking cancer through multiple pathways. Learn more at danafarber.org/stories. And the Annie E. Casey Foundation.
It's 52 degrees in the University District. This is 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. 6 minutes past noon. Here's Bill Radke with Week in Review.
Hi, welcome to Friday, and welcome to Week in Review. I am Bill Radke. I do know journalists, so I ask some of my favorite local journalists to gather with me on Fridays and break down the week's big events for you. And we live stream the whole thing so that our faces are not wasted on just the radio. So I can go right now, and so can you. You can go on YouTube or Facebook and search KUOW Public Radio, and you'll see NPR's National Desk Correspondent specializing on the law enforcement beat, Martin Kaste. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Oh, thanks, Bill. Nice to be here.
See you. Seattle Times Senior Investigative Reporter Jonathan Martin. Welcome back, Jonathan.
Hey, Bill.
Great to have you. Crosscut Central and Eastern Washington reporter Mai Hoang. Maya, you're in Yakima, correct?
Yes, I am. Hi, Bill. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure, and it's really good to see you back again, Mai. How's Yakima?
It's good. It's sunny outside. It's we've had some good temperatures. The days are longer. It's great.
I see Taco Fest is returning. Canceled the last 2 years in Yakima.
Yes, it is next month. So if you love tacos, come over here.
Show over there. I saw.
Actually, you can have tacos anytime, but yeah, it'll be contained in one area. All the tacos you could ever want.
Right. I know this because the Yakima Herald has a photo of a restaurant owner cooking there at the festival in 2019 with a T-shirt that says, "If you don't like tacos, I'm nacho type." So that's
God.
I love it.
News. Okay, let's begin on Week in Review, and we're going to start with Seattle's crime response, a topic, of course, we've been touching on a lot. And just this week in Columbia City, there was a fatal shooting. A man killed there, a woman in critical condition, and there were shootings in West Seattle and Pioneer Square. And we all know about shootings and shoplifting downtown. From the Seattle Times, Jonathan Martin, what are you noticing about Seattle's crime response lately?
Well, we had an interesting use of basically transit rules to have an enforcement corridor along 3rd Avenue, that main bus corridor. I hadn't really known that the rules governing how conduct on a bus could actually be extended to the bus stops themselves. Bruce Harrell stepped back from that, put it on pause for reasons that are not clear at all. But I think the downtown crime issue is an interesting one for us because it kind of bumps up between the desire for public safety, and particularly in a downtown core, with what is a very progressive law enforcement regime in Seattle. We have my colleague Danny Westneat wrote about a recent sting at Little Saigon, where there was an open air drug market that was really causing a lot of troubles for the businesses and the residents there, and noted that with all that work that we're putting in that hotspot policing, that people were mostly just booked into jail and then released very quickly, including people with multiple felony convictions. There's one guy who had 39 arrest warrants, a gun, a bunch of fentanyl and cash, and got out. The prosecutors had wanted a $75,000 bail, and he was let out on $2,500 and was spent basically a day or two in jail. So it's interesting that I don't quite know where this conflict is going to land, but it's one that we'll keep watching.
I mentioned, Martin, you're on the law enforcement beat at NPR. Any observations on all of this?
Well, Seattle isn't alone, that's for sure. I mean, I just came back from Philadelphia reporting on some stories, and they're breaking not just homicide records since the 90s, which is what a lot of big cities have been doing, but all-time homicide records. And when Philadelphia says we've had more murders than ever before last year, and we're on pace to break that record again this year, it's a bona fide emergency there. And they have similar, but everywhere you see these sort of intersections between the push for reform and progressivism or whatever it is on one side, especially gained so much momentum in 2020.
versus sort of this, some of these grim realities. And a lot of this, criminologists love to talk about sort of what do we really know in terms of deterrence, what really works. And, we're doing this massive experiment right now. And the one thing that a lot of them can agree on, they do disagree on a lot of things, but one thing is the sense that length of punishment isn't really what deters crime, but the sense that you will get caught and there will be a penalty of some sort. They call this swift and certain deterrence. That is one thing, criminologists on different parts of the spectrum kind of agree on. So the real question, I guess, for them would be looking at the situation you just described there in Little Saigon or someplace else. Is there a sort of a pervasive sense in Seattle, in Philadelphia, somewhere else, that there's a greater likelihood that if I do certain things, I will get caught and I will pay some kind of penalty, or not? Or is there a sense of just impunity that it's catch and release? And whether or not you choose to believe the theory, that is kind of the dominant theory in criminology right now, is that you have to have a sense of consequence. And I'm not sure that exists right now in Seattle.
Yeah, we seem to be going back and forth on that spectrum. I know you, as I said, you're in Yakima. Do you have any observations from there or questions for?
I mean, I agree. I don't think Seattle or Philadelphia is alone with crime, unfortunately. I mean, in Yakima, we've seen a number of shootings recently, some fatal, and most recently we had a shooting at Eisenhower High School in Yakima, which killed a teenager. It was his cousin, who is the suspect, and there's been a number of gang-related shootings recently. The gang issue has always been a problem in our region, but it seems to kind of reached a fever pitch more recently. So I think everyone is grappling with, how do we solve this problem? How do we, punish people and actually how to get convictions? Because in some cases, we've had homicides in Yakima where you would think it's a slam dunk, and then the guy gets off, and it's because the case didn't work or the prosecutor didn't make the case. So it's challenging for sure.
Does Yakima have the same, sorry, this is Martin, I'm jumping in, I'm just kind of curious, the same sort of backlog still post-COVID and just processing cases in the courts? Because that sure is a factor here.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we definitely have seen a backlog for sure. So I think they're starting to get into it. But yeah, I think we're, again, like other places, COVID has really impacted the court system too.
So Jonathan, where does this put Seattle in terms of defunding the police?
Well, I was just thinking there is, wouldn't blame your listeners for having some cognitive dissonance about our approach to crime. We had a city council just 2 years ago pledging to defund that. They did some cuts, but it was not a full defund. And now we're talking about using savings from the large number of police officers who left to have hiring incentives, because now we want more. We realize that the response times have escalated dramatically, particularly for low-level crimes, but even for more serious crimes. So I don't know where we're at, Bill. Like I said, it feels to me like cognitive dissonance reading our morning news meeting almost every day now. Our police reporters are chasing a shooting. And this is a city that had typically 25 murders a year or so. It was kind of famous for having a low violent crime rate. And I don't know what we make of it. It's really kind of, as a longtime Seattleite, it's really disturbing. It feels like there's a city in flux.
And there's something about the nature of some of the crime. Statistically, I'm not sure any of this is significant, but anecdotally, so I live in Wedgwood, and Sunday morning I walk over to the Rite Aid on the corner of 35th and 85th there, little quiet Wedgwood, and it's all plywooded up because someone rammed through the glass front of the building overnight to try to get at an ATM machine, which of course we've seen multiple cases of this around town. I don't know if it's one group or copycats, but the woman on duty at the counter, an elderly woman working there still at the Rite Aid, was totally shaken. She hadn't seen it, but coming in and seeing that, and we chatted for a while, and she had this sense of things have shifted, and she was freaked out.
Yeah, it's really interesting, being over here and hearing, I mean, from Yakima, hearing people talk about Seattle and crime, because it's almost like, I feel like it's almost used as like a political hot topic. A lot of conservatives will almost use Seattle as like, oh, well, look at all the crime here. Look at, look what happened when they defunded the police. It's almost like they can use it as, it'd be interesting, I mean, to see if it's used as like a campaign topic or as a, as kind of a campaign tool, or to say, I'm gonna put more funding, or like, and I feel like nationally, Seattle in general has been a big hot topic in terms of, and kind of a lightning rod for conservatives, kind of a whipping boy, kind of to say, look at Seattle, they tried defunding, it didn't work. So
is that the national perception, is that Seattle defunded the police?
Among conservatives, I mean, if you watch any conservative talk show, it's like, they can't get Seattle out of their mouths. I mean, I go to the gym and I watch the national news or outlets like Fox News, and it's like they talk about Seattle all the time, and they talk about the crime and they talk about homelessness, and it's like political catnip for some folks over there.
They also can't tell us apart from Portland, which is part of the phenomenon there. They always confuse us with what happened in Portland the same summer.
Jonathan, before we leave the topic of crime, the Seattle Times reported on the fact that pot shops are a crime target because they've got a lot of cash on hand. So is there any realistic attempt to change that?
Well, this is, I think that the point that Martin made about sort of maybe the sense of impunity for committing crimes is kind of hits right at that trend. But yeah, there's the number of cannabis store armed robberies. I think I saw that we had had twice as many this year as so far in 2022 as we'd had last year. And the real issue there is these are cash businesses because Congress has failed to act on a whole set of laws, proposals to allow cannabis shops to bank. It's kind of absurd in my view, because 38 states in the country have some legal form of cannabis. The voters have spoken on marijuana legalization, whether Congress is actually hearing this or not. So the lack of action on these marijuana banking reforms that would allow them to access to FDIC insured banks is really, it's not a statement of the drug war. What it's doing is endangering staff at these stores.
Yeah, it's just really fascinating to me to see that all these states, politicians, they love the tax revenue. I mean, these pot shops bring in a lot of tax revenue, but yet, in Washington State, we've had legalization for a decade now, and these businesses are still not seen as legitimate. They're still seen as kind of, these shady shops. And if you talk to pot owners, they're business people. They're just as much part of the business community as a clothing store or a grocery store or any other business, but yet they're treated like, oh, we're your black market business, so we can't lend you money, or these laws prevent them from getting loans and from accessing credit card systems, things that would make them legitimate. And I feel like also from a crime standpoint, these pot shops are seen as targets because they're seen as these like shady places where they can maybe get away with robbing and whatnot.
Yep, Mai's right. It's $1 billion per budget cycle in pot taxes. It's like 2% of the state budgets now. It's not a minor industry anymore.
And I think the cash thing is a big factor, but also just remember how we intentionally zoned pot shops to be away from other places that are maybe a little more paid attention to, schools, all that stuff. We ended up putting them on Lake City Way or where it, and it's, if you want to get in, get out fast with a gun, they're, geographically, they're often a good spot too.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, definitely in where I am. Yeah, they're definitely kind of out of the way. They're kind of in rougher areas of the city. So yeah, that makes total sense.
And Jonathan, you used the word impunity. Were you saying that there's that impunity is especially at play when it comes to pot shops, or are those just side by side?
I think those are side by side. I think we're seeing a lot of retail thefts, and the marijuana stores maybe are particularly vulnerable because that they're not doing credit card transactions.
While everybody else is more and more. I mean, there are places that are not dealing in cash at all. So the places that are dealing in cash are even fewer and fewer. Okay, let's pause there. You're listening to Week in Review. Maybe you're watching Week in Review on YouTube or Facebook. And we are going to take a short break. We're going to talk Starbucks union vote. We're going to talk about a complaint, a lawsuit, in fact, that our state redistricting is being improperly done on the basis of race. That and more coming up on Week in Review. Don't go away.
Thanks for being with us on 94.9 KUOW. It's 1221.
Support for KUOW comes from Oxbow Farm and Conservation Center, providing healthy organic produce, native plant production, restoration of natural habitats, and immersive learning opportunities for kids and adults. Learn more at oxbow.org.
For 70 years, KUOW's mission has been to create and serve a more informed public. We're here to help you make sense of confusing times with factual and trusted information, and maybe even a little inspiration and delight along the way. We've moved our spring drive so we can focus on bringing you more news coverage right now. Listener contributions make everything you hear on air and read online possible at KUOW. Make a gift online at kuow.org/donate. And thank you so much. Let's get back to Bill and his guests on Week in Review.
Bill Radke here, bringing you the news of the week and figuring it all out with the Seattle Times, Jonathan Martin, NPR's Martin Kaste, and Crosscut's Hoang. Our state recently redrew our voting boundaries. We do this every year. It's called redistricting. And how you draw those boundaries matters because it affects who gets elected. It affects how much say a voter can have depending where they live. And there is another lawsuit claiming that these boundaries were unfairly drawn. What is the argument?
Yeah, so Ben Garcia, he's a Sunnyside resident. He sued the state. He's saying that the quote was racial gerrymandering for the 15th legislative district, which is in central Washington. And he's arguing that it was purely drawn based on race and that there was no justification to do so.
And my understanding is that you can gerrymander for partisan reasons if your state allows that, but you can't gerrymander on a racial or ethnic basis. Is that right?
No, that's what this guy's arguing. And, he's saying that specifically, and I guess, to give some context to why this is interesting is that as many know, that there was another lawsuit that was filed in January for the opposite reason, that was saying that they did not redraw the district properly and broke voting rights laws because they did not draw the majority Latino district properly and weakened Latino voter strength. So this is almost the 180 of that. And it kind of reflects, when the commission that worked on this map, you had two Republicans and you had two Democrats. The Republicans wanted to keep it as it is, because it's basically white and conservative. The Democrats wanted a Latino majority district to increase the chances of a Democrat candidate. And they kind of arrived here, in this compromise. And clearly, nobody's really happy with what turned out.
Yeah, I know the U.S. Supreme Court in the 90s ruled that racial gerrymandering is a violation of constitutional rights. Race is not the same as ethnicity. Mm-hmm. Obviously, no, voters don't vote monolithically by race.
Right.
But can you give us any sense whether, given these different arguments, would you say Latino voter strength has been diluted or strengthened under the new maps?
I mean, depends on who you talk to. I mean, that's what's really fascinating for me about this is that, yeah, if you talk to the folks that filed the lawsuit in January, they'd say it's diluted because that there's been a historic attempt at suppressing Latino voters, and that this is just an addition to that. But if you talk to the Ben Garcia and the people behind this lawsuit, they'll argue that's strengthened and that, and of course, there's been a number, we've talked about this before, Bill, there's been a number of court cases that have led to Latino majority districts in the city of Yakima, for example. So, they're definitely, Republicans would argue that the Latino vote is strengthened and so, yeah, it's very much who we talk to. And that's what makes, this whole thing very interesting.
Any other reactions, questions from Martin or Jonathan?
But not to get too much into the process, but Washington has had has a redistricting process, which has been kind of held up nationally. It has a commission. Some states task the legislators with redrawing maps, which is obviously an inherently fraught proposition. But Washington has a process in having a 4-person commission with a non-voting chair, and each of those, and two from each party. So the Democrats and Republicans each dominate 2, which really requires obviously compromise. And that process has seemed to be mostly worked. So it's been held up nationally. This time around, they kind of fell all over themselves. For one thing, they violated the Open Meetings Act for basically voting in secret. They ended up paying $137,000 to settle that lawsuit by the Washington Coalition for Open Government. Melissa Santos at Crosscut recently reported that they also withheld text messages from their process. And the chair of the commission, the non-voting chair, quit in protest because the Secretary of State, who's a Democrat, did not back the commission's maps in a lawsuit. They basically decided to not sort of defend it, and the whole thing looks stinky. Frankly, it was a bad process of what had been pretty good government up until now.
I mean, what's incredible is if you look at the process itself, like leading up to the vote, there was so much public input. There were so many stakeholders involved. I mean, with Latino voters, there were several groups. You had the UCLA Voting Rights Project. I mean, you had a ton of feedback. There was not a lack of public, feedback and input on this process, but yet all that was totally disregarded at the end. And yeah, I mean, the lack of confidence in these maps, it's fascinating to see them just back off and suddenly be like, nope, I'm not associating with this.
I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. Is there this lack of confidence, you say, for both the legislative redistricting and for the state legislature and for the congressional districts? Or are we just talking about, because the lawsuit you're reporting on is for the legislative district, right? So is this true also for the congressional districts?
It's my understanding that the legislative districts are more of a pinch point. And I think that in Yakima, I believe there's also an issue involving whether the Yakima Nation was split into 2 different districts in an attempt to accommodate a Latino voting bloc, and it basically kind of screwed the Yakima Nation.
I see.
Yeah.
So it's more about the state legislative districts then.
Right. Yeah. But I just think in general, like, even if they're not as taking as much issue with the congressional district, I mean, just the whole process, the lack of confidence in the process is striking. And to see all these people on the staff, like Jamie Nixon, he's been very public on Twitter about, just the fallacies of the process. And just to see all these folks just really express frustration and anger at how just the process unfolding that badly.
Right. Were legislative staffers improperly involved? And then again with the deleted texts.
No, I handle Public Records Act litigation for the Seattle Times. And one of the things that'll be interesting is this is a case where actually the text messages were deleted right after the maps were approved. And this was by one of the commissioners. That's potentially a crime. It's not the violation of Public Records Act is a crime. It's deletion of government records, and we've just never seen anybody prosecuted for something like that. And I think that would be interesting as a message to public officials across Washington if there was a case of a prosecution of deleting text messages, as we've seen that of course you referenced the city of Seattle case with the Seattle Times involved in suing the city of Seattle over missing text messages as well. So I just want to put that out there. It would be an interesting message that would be sent.
I think it'd be a great message just because, I mean, we're speaking a little outside redistricting. I just think there's been an assault by state politicians on open records and open meetings in general. We've seen legislation attempted at the state level to limit access to public records. And it would be really interesting if something like that happened. And, maybe that would make politicians back off a little bit in terms of trying to, limit access to public records.
Yeah, well, especially the last 2 years when everything was forced into the digital sphere, every what would have been a hallway conversation, which would have been, immune from these requests. All of a sudden there's a digital trail, and the temptation for a human being just to cover that up real fast is not a good one, but it's a real one.
That's Martin Kaste, NPR National Desk correspondent. We've got Seattle Times senior investigative editor Jonathan Martin, and Crosscut Central and Eastern Washington reporter Mai Hoang. And moving on to some other news this week, employees at a Capitol Hill Starbucks voted unanimously to be represented by a union. This is the store at Denny and Broadway, and it's the first unionized Starbucks now on the West Coast. There have been unions at Starbucks before. Maybe we can talk about that. But Jonathan, this does follow yes votes around Buffalo, New York, and Mesa, Arizona, now Seattle. Why is this happening? And do you think this is going to keep spreading?
I know too that an REI store in Manhattan also voted to unionize. There's Apple stores that are being there's unionization efforts. Amazon, and certainly the Amazon has this happening on a bunch of fronts. Yep. I think that the why now question. This is my theory is that I think workers are feeling empowered now. You have a very tight labor market. You have the people are just sort of desperate to get staff. And you also have retail growth is just going crazy. It's almost sort of defying the pandemic, theory that, growth in the retail sector is twice what it was before the pandemic. So you have companies making a lot of money. And I think a third factor I just put in is just sort of like personal theory. I think that if anybody's worked with millennials and Gen Xers in their offices, I think they have a different view of the workplace. I think the status quo is not okay. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's the idea of sort of paying your dues and sort of sucking it up does not resonate well with the younger workers. So I think that probably those three factors in the worker empowerment, the companies making a bunch of money, and sort of a generational intolerance for the status quo.
And in Seattle, the cost of living, obviously. But yes. Any other reaction, Martin or Mai?
Yeah, I think we need to look at the industries that are unionizing. We're looking at retail, service. We're seeing some union activity, attempts at union activity over here in Eastern Washington with ag too. So these are industries that had to work during COVID. They were the essential worker. I mean, not all retail, but a lot of retail, restaurants and things remained open for takeout and that sort of thing. And so they had to bear a lot of risk for illness. And, so the topic of safety rules and working conditions were top of mind for a lot of these workers because, they were not only trying to go to work, they were trying to not get COVID. And so, you have a group of workers that felt like, hey, we put a lot of risk. We took on a lot of risk for you, mm-hmm. and we deserve a lot more than you're giving us. And, they see the unionization as a way to say, hey, we need to get fair pay. Yeah, I mean, in the Yakima Valley during 2020, you saw these fruit packing warehouses protests. And yeah, I agree with Jonathan. There is a sense of empowerment among these workers. They have a lot of public goodwill. I mean, the public sees these workers are working hard, they're bearing a lot of risk. So they have the public sentiment in their favor. So yeah, so that's kind of, I can see why unions are getting passed because, you don't only have among your coworkers, you have the public in support of you because they've seen you work during the pandemic.
I think part of also the success right now, and it's still relatively speaking, right? It's still a very small percentage of the American mm-hmm. workforce, but until now, at least, the only section of the workforce that was growing that was in terms of unionization was public sector workers. That was sort of the holdout. But I think maybe one of the reasons also that these drives are succeeding more than they used to is the young workers simply don't have a family memory of someone like a parent working for the unions. That's so far in the past now. The deunionization has been going on for decades now. And so some of the criticisms of being in a union, some of the old saws about the downsides, about wasted time, about bureaucracy, about all the kinds of things that an Amazon or a Starbucks might raise. You're an associate, you're not a worker, that kind of thing. I think it falls flat. I think some of these younger workers simply don't have echoes in their family of an uncle who said, yeah, I hated the union. They just don't have those negative family memories. So I think there's just more fertile ground.
Yeah, the unions, there, as I said, there were some Starbucks stores unionized in the 80s and 90s, and it didn't last.
Actually,
yes, Jonathan.
I was actually working at Starbucks when the union, there's a commercial, UFCW had unionized the roasting plant where I was at. And it basically was decertified itself. And it was interesting going back and looking at the profiles of Howard Schultz written when he ran for president. There's a lot of attention paid to that, how much Howard Schultz really put pressure on the workers to break up the union and really fought unionization efforts for a long time with the caveat that Starbucks had a reputation for being pretty good to its workers in terms of healthcare benefits and some stock options and that kind of thing. So I think he tried to wear kind of the white hat as an employer, but that there is that history that Starbucks CEO at the time would really pressure the union to break up.
Jonathan, do you recall what was the rap against the union at the time? What was the rationale for decertifying?
I was like a 20-something college kid. I paid no attention whatsoever to this, to be honest with you. So I don't remember what the knock was. It was a pretty small union, if I recall, a couple hundred people. So
food workers tend to come and go. Well, we'll talk more about union votes because they're going to keep coming, Starbucks included. So we'll get back to that. You're listening to Week in Review with the Seattle Times' Jonathan Martin there and NPR's Martin Kaste and Crosscut's My Hoang. I'm Bill Radke. Short break now, and the shopping mall lives when we return.
Support for KUOW comes from greencars.com, a website to help users find an electric car that best fits their life. Learn more at greencars.com. Help drive the future.
It's 12:38. Thanks for joining us on KUOW 94.9, Seattle's NPR news station.
This week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, I'll talk with historian Jill Lepore about why our schools have become ground zero for the culture wars. That's next time on the New Yorker Radio Hour.
Listen to that at 1 o'clock tomorrow afternoon.
Support for KUOW comes from Yellowwood Academy, an accredited 4 through 12 nonprofit school on Mercer Island, offering one-to-one and small group classes designed for each student, hosting a virtual open house April 2nd and May 7th at 10 a.m. Registration at yellowwoodacademy.org.
It's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. And don't take my word for it. You can see that NPR's Martin Kaste is on the show today with Crosscut's My Hoang and the Seattle Times' Jonathan Martin, because we stream this thing live on YouTube and Facebook. You just search KUOW Public Radio. Continuing on with the week's news, we have heard for decades that the American shopping mall is dead, and you have found that that's not really true.
Yeah, I just wrote a story for Crosscut. I wrote a story about the mall, Raleigh Mall. It's in a town called Union Gap. Actually, little bit of fun history. The Union Gap used to be called Yakima, and what happened was that the trains went up to North Yakima, and there was a compelling deal back then that got all the businesses that went up to North Yakima, which is now like the city of Yakima, and so. So this is kind of funny that Union Gap is now our major retail center, because back in the 1800s, everyone was leaving Union Gap, and now everyone's coming back in. So,
and it's called Union Gap not because a Gap store opened there in the 1800s. Why is it called Union Gap? Do you know?
This is embarrassing. I don't know. I should know, but I don't.
But anyway, but there's a mall, a shopping
Yes.
mall that lives on. 50
Yeah, and so this mall just they're marking 50 years in operation this year. And so I just kind of got curious because I mean, you hear this narrative about malls dying, and yet here is a mall that has been in operation for 50 years and actually is doing pretty well. And I've actually noticed, and I noticed like a whole bunch of local businesses moving there recently. And so I went and talked to one of them. And I think one of the businesses I talked to is a clothing store called Wild J. It had been in downtown Yakima for a few years. And yeah, the mall actually pursued the owner. Her name's Shadira Amara. And she's like, nah, I don't want to go to the mall. I feel comfortable downtown. She felt she was a boutique. That's where she belonged. And then finally, you know, she went through COVID. COVID was hard on her business, like every other business. And so she took the call. She went and met with them and she said, they sat down with me and they told me the numbers. And when she heard the numbers, you know, the foot traffic numbers, it was well above whatever she was getting downtown. And then a month later, she moved to the mall. And so, yeah, there are people still going to the mall. And I will say, I think a big caveat is that we're located in a relatively less populated area than like Seattle. So the nearest mall to us is about 85 miles away in the Tri-Cities in Kennewick. So there is a little bit of advantage because there's a bit of a captive market that the Valley Mall has that maybe, you know, mall, you know, all the malls in Seattle, you know, there's like 5 or 6 malls that are competing against each other. So we don't have that level of competition, but still your mall could still die if you don't respond to, you know, community changes, the market needs, all that stuff. And I think this mall did all those things. And so now they're, you know, I mean, I think people there would still say that, hey, I still drive to Seattle, go to, you know, or Bellevue Square because they have this fancy shop that isn't in Yakima. But for the most part, you can pretty much buy what you need over there. So
I want to hear from the two Martins. I'll just pass on some comments we got from the Community Feedback Club, which is you can just go to kuow.org/feedback and sign up, and you'd be one of the people who we asked for your opinion on some of the on current events. So we asked some of you at the Community Feedback Club. Karin says, nothing brings me to a mall. Even pre-pandemic, it was a place to hang out as a teen, and I see potential for becoming a mall walker when I'm older and not up for walking trails in the rain anymore. Otherwise, malls are overwhelming to my senses and reek of capitalism. Tanya says, nothing would bring me to malls, but dead malls would make fabulous homeless shelters, bathrooms, food court with full kitchens, stores made into rooms. And Iskra says, I learned to love Northgate when I moved to the North End. My stereotypes about them being bland and soulless were erased when I realized every class and age of people shopped there. Among the customers, I usually heard at least 5 different languages. In a 10-minute commute, I could shop for all my clothes, bedding, furniture, housewares, get shoes and watch repaired, buy books, get dinner out, followed by a movie. Now I can watch hockey practice. I miss the old Northgate desperately. And I would just chime in or echo that maybe if there was a stereotype when that I'm old enough to remember that malls were suburban and white and bland and all the same. Crossroads Shopping Mall is like the United Nations.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway,
yeah.
Any other reactions to malls?
I agree about Northgate. I miss it too. It was a total cultural crossroads. I mean, yeah, not my favorite architecture, but if it's miserable outside, I'm sure. I thought the forecasts of the doom of that model were a little premature. I have an 8th grade daughter who keeps, I think she fell in love with the idea of the mall on Stranger Things. And she keeps telling me, boy, you were lucky to grow up in the 80s. That must've been so great.
Yeah, but horrible monsters attacked.
I think that was part of it too. She probably...
Right. Kids on bikes.
Yeah, exactly. But you know, especially if it's miserable outside, it is nice to have everything in one spot. You know.
I was curious. Is the Union Gap Mall more upscale, or is it more sort of traditional?
Yeah, it's definitely more traditional. And I also want to jump on Bill's point about diversity, because obviously being in the Yakima Valley, Yakima County is half Latino. So yeah, it's not white people. There are people, in fact, I think the Latino market is a crucial part of the mall. And this is why the mall one of the things the mall is doing is the mall manager is on the board of directors for the Central Washington Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. They're hosting their big Estrella Awards in the fall. And they're also, speaking of Taco Fest, you talked about that earlier in the show, the Valley Mall is actually the presenting sponsor of that Taco Fest. So they definitely know what their market is.
It's interesting, the malls that have survived in the Seattle area seem to kind of thrive are kind of the more luxury ones. Like, U Village and Bellevue Square seem to be going, like they're expanding, not shrinking. Whereas the Northgate is kind of like I said, basically a little shop adjacent to a hockey complex. And I grew up and went to the Tacoma Mall back in the day and would make the trek in when I lived way outside the city. But it was sort of the place to go and be seen, very much like Stranger Things.
Yeah. Pacific Place Mall has really slimmed down. It's far fewer or barely any known national chains. It's like you mentioned, it's much more local. There's a lot of local places, a lot of sort of arts and crafts, and we go to we've now, my family, we like Din Tai Fung, and instead of going to the east side where you'll wait for hours, the Din Tai Fung at Pacific Place Mall, it's still pretty hopping, but since that mall is just not the attraction it used to be, we can get seated.
Well, and a downtown mall right now, given what's going on in downtown Seattle in terms of public safety, I mean, the contrast between the scene there and Bellevue right now at Christmas was pretty stark. When we went shopping, it's like, oh, Bellevue still feels normal, not downtown Seattle.
Yeah. And that just speaks to the trend towards of retail going out of, mall major, although not maybe in Seattle so much, but I mean, my story talked about how, the Valley Mall was actually struggling in the 90s because the big mall there was the downtown Yakima Mall. And then that mall closed in 2003. So because all the merchants like Bon Marché went out to the Union Gap Mall. So
yeah,
I think that's not surprising to see Pacific Place is not doing. And also I would like to point out, Crosscut, we actually did a story, and my colleague at Crosscut did a story about, the increase in local businesses. So yeah, that's definitely happening
at Pacific Place. Yeah. Finally, before we leave this, Eric, when we asked this question about malls, Eric wrote in and said, does U Village count as a mall? I go there. It's dog friendly, offers a lot in terms of product variety and food. I would say U Village is a mall, even though it's heavily outdoors.
Yeah, I mean, I think
not so sure. I think you.
No, it's that California model, whatever they call that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think
the umbrellas everywhere. Sorry.
Oh yeah, sorry to interrupt. It's the ICSC. Speaking of which, they went through a name change. They used to be the International Council of Shopping Centers, and then during COVID, they actually changed to the innovating commerce for communities or something, to reflect that they're not just a trade organization for shopping centers. But yeah, actually they would classify probably University Village as an open air shopping center. So technically probably.
Right. So that was those were some of our listeners at our community feedback club, which again, if you want to be part of that and tell us what you think, kuow.org/feedback. Okay, we're coming toward the end of the show on Week in Review. Before we give you something to smile about, as we always do at the end, Jonathan Martin, I noted that the Seattle Times reported this week on the former Speaker of the State House redirecting, I guess, a couple $1 million that was going to go to a couple of nonprofits. He got it earmarked for a nonprofit that he co-founded. But you're the investigations editor. Is that scandalous? Is that not allowed? Will you explain that?
Well, I mean, earmarks are an old business, whether they're in Olympia or in Washington, D.C. And this is basically an earmark. It was an unusual process, but it caught my eye because it really went counter to what the King County, the state, Seattle have tried to do about homeless response, is to regionalize the approach and to basically try and take politics out of it. The previous model in Seattle was basically for city council members to kind of earmark for their favorite nonprofits to do this service and that service. The Regional Homeless Authority it's supposed to be sort of more policy focused, sort of the experts in charge. And they didn't like the model, which is basically the tiny house village that was run by this nonprofit that Frank Chop co-founded, Low Income Housing Institute, has really sort of cornered the market on. It's a small, tiny house village with like case management around it. They want, the regional homeless authority want to have more mix and types of these facilities, and they had actually turned down 2 proposals from Lehigh, as Erica Barnett reported, and so it was unusual that you had a politician basically going in and telling the experts that were trying to really sort of put a different approach on our homeless response. No, I know better, and this is what you're going to do with the money.
Okay. And this is, but we don't know that Frank Chop is personally benefiting. He's just has been in the past very involved with this and other service organizations as well.
Yeah, certainly. Frank Chop has a long history in doing, being involved in low-income housing development, of course. But that was the thing that I think that was struck us in our newsroom, is like, where there really was just counter to what we've decided as a region that we had the best way to approach homelessness.
Right. Also this week, our governor signed 3 gun-related bills. One prohibits the sale of gun magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. Another is aimed at untraceable so-called ghost guns. It says guns and their parts have to have serial numbers. A third law bans weapons at public gatherings like school board meetings and election-related facilities. Martin, I don't know if you, in covering law enforcement for NPR, if you deal much in gun law, but any
these moves have been echoed around the country to some degree or other, depending on the politics of the state. When it comes to magazines, you can argue a lot about whether this affects the practical access to the larger magazines. Obviously, it's you can still own them, you can buy them in another state, so does it really make a difference? California, which banned them, still has people with longer magazines being used in crimes. The reason I think there's some attention on it, whether or not this law actually restricts the access, the reason there's so much concern is just because the nature of gun crime has really shifted in the last just 2 or 3 years. Excuse me, even towards this more undisciplined spraying of ammo around by often younger shooters. Just mentioning my trip to Philadelphia, I was at a scene with the homicide detectives, and they're used to seeing at least like 15, 20 shells at a scene. That's just the sort of the spraying, and a lot of bystanders are getting hit when they aren't even being aimed at, that kind of thing. So there's a sense that, well, if you limit the ammo supply for a given assailant at a certain time, maybe we'll have less of that. Whether that comes out in the numbers, in terms of numbers of victims, I don't know. But I think that's where that's coming from. The ghost guns thing, that's also numerically a very small portion of guns. We've had gun sales in general in this country are through the roof, and that's for normal guns, not these unmarked guns. I was just looking at a new survey out of a group at the University of Chicago. It says 1 in 5 American households purchased a gun during the pandemic. 1 in 5. And so whether what the connection to crime is there becomes very political, very heated, very fast. But there is analysis showing that the time to crime on a purchased gun has gotten shorter in the last 2 years. That, in other words, the number of months it takes for a newly purchased legal gun to end up being used in a crime, that time has shortened significantly on average. And that tells you that more new legally purchased guns are somehow ending up in crime, whether they were stolen or whether they were used by the legal owner. That's unclear. But, things have shifted in the last couple of years. And I think there's a reckoning here for the society in terms of just the number of new guns just out there.
Martin, I was struck by, like, when I was seeing that the magazine limits were going in, felt like kind of flashbacks like 2014. Like, this feels like it was a very, like, I feel like there's a big push on these magazines around Sandy Hook, if I recall.
Yeah.
Because there was a large magazine using that one. I just felt, I was a little surprised. Washington has done a lot of gun regulations, mostly by initiative, some of it by initiative. I'm surprised that I just felt like an old story that came back.
Yeah.
I think there was an attempt at the time, maybe that failed, but yeah, and it's one of those things that it's already been tested in the court. So if you're on the gun control side, you can pass this, right, and it'll hold up. I think is the thinking there.
Yeah, speaking of past crimes, my colleague Melissa Santos did a story about this legislation, and she actually interviewed someone that survived the shootings in Las Vegas. That, speaking of going back to the past, at that music festival. And I think the thing that struck me reading that story was her observation that the shooter was using a magazine that could shoot hundreds, hundreds. And that's, I mean, for me, like that was a visual, like, and I, you know,
well, that was the
visual
bump stock issue.
Yeah.
I was there covering that, and there the issue was this sort of, you know, kludgy thing you can buy to keep it shooting when it's semi-automatic as opposed to automatic. But he had several guns. He just went from one to the next.
Yeah. So that image, like, it's kind of that image, and, you know, and I can see why legislation would pass if you have someone telling you that story, and then, you know, that image of, you know, a magazine that large, you know.
Yeah.
Okay, now I need something to smile about after all. 3 minutes left in our show. We always try to end on something hopeful or smile worthy. I saw that our governor is probably going to sign this law, presumably designating pickleball our official state sport. It was invented on Bainbridge Island. And KUOW's thank you, Tom Bonsi, for telling us that we would be the 16th state to have a state sport. Hawaii has surfing, Minnesota has ice hockey, Alaska has dog mushing.
Don't ask me to explain Colorado, where the state sport is pack burro racing, or Maryland, where it's jousting. Oregon and Idaho don't have an official state sport. At the Washington legislature, Senator John Lovick quoted a constituent to explain why he served up pickleball to be the state sport.
She said, Washington will someday be known as the birthplace of Boeing, Microsoft, Starbucks, and pickleball. Let's boast about this history and make pickleball the official sport.
That hurts if you're Amazon or Costco and you didn't make the list, but pickleball did. That made me smile. Anything else to end the show with, my team?
I want to jump about pickleball because my sister-in-law and my brother are obsessed with pickleball. My sister-in-law actually run like tournaments for pickleball, like big tournaments, and it's like the amazing, and like she's like serious about it. She like told me, she's like, I like to play, there's levels that you played in pickleball, and she said, I'm a 4, but I like to play against level 5 people to challenge myself. So there's people that are committed to the sport.
Oh, very good. Yeah, it's a thing. Anything else before we got a minute and 20 seconds left?
This is Martin. I'm very buoyed up by the sight of my daughters once again doing things like music in public. My older daughter goes to Roosevelt High, and we had the Hot Java Cool Jazz at the Paramount last weekend, and it was just a blast. I mean, that was 2 springs ago. That was canceled, and everything went underground. And now these kids can once again perform in public, and they're hoping to go to New York, and it's kind of cheerful to see that.
Roosevelt's a great jazz program. Jonathan, anything to leave us with? Pickleball?
My smile for the weekend is I'm going spring skiing. It's trying to squeeze in the last little bit of the season. Not quite in shirt sleeves yet, but hopefully some sun.
You got to go pretty high.
Stevens, I have Stevens Pass, and it's still got snow.
All right. Well, enjoy snow pickleball, I assume is what's happening up there. Jonathan Martin, Senior Investigations Editor, Seattle Times. Martin Kaste, NPR's National Desk Correspondent, law enforcement reporter, among other things. Crosscut Central and Eastern Washington reporter, Mai Hoang. Great job this last hour. Thanks a lot for being Week in Review.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Bill.
Our show is produced by Kevin Knistet, social media and live streaming by Tio Popescu and Juan Pablo Chiquiza. And Catherine Banwell's operating our board and making us sound great today. I'm Bill Radke. We'll talk to you next week.